Lovely. Thank you for having me back to SOAP. I'm so pleased that you're going ahead, even if you're having some technical glitches. I don't think anybody minds as long as we are getting that good content. So we're going to go relatively quickly because I don't want to bore anyone. So in this session, we're going to look at what is an operating model in general, and then for content, how do you take a content strategy and turn it into content operations, and then more specifically techcomm in techcomm operating models, how to improve them. We're going to look at an example and then give you some tips on how to start your own content operations. So first of all, what is an operating model? So I have a whole bunch of definitions. I like these three, and it really is about kind of how you run your production line, if you will, like your content production. And Tomek, who was just before me, had a little bit of the that same vein. He talked about how they produce content. So it's Deloitte says that's how you deliver your strategy, and it's about everything. It's not just about one aspect. It's about the whole production process. We have lots of ops models now. It seems everybody has DevOps, design ops, research ops, AI ops, IT ops, data ops. It just goes on and on. So these are some of the operating models that you can look at to get inspiration, because they connect to our profession. So DevOps connects because we're creating content that often affects code production, or it's part of code production. There's design, and we have content that goes into the design and so on. So I'm going to use DevOps as an example. DevOps, if you look at the definition, it's about shortening the development life cycles. So it's about efficiency. And so it's about automation and monitoring all steps and making it better, that kind of continuous loop. So if we take DevOps as an example, we can extrapolate that same thing for content ops. It's about shortening our development cycles, automating whatever we can automate, and monitoring at all steps. So we want to keep up the quality and at the same time that we shorten. So it's about working smarter instead of harder. Now, there are kind of two levels of operational improvement that we can look at. So one is tactical. So if you're thinking about how does this affect my job? Well, it's about maintaining the signals of truth and reducing the inefficiency of these rote tasks. So, not tracking things in a spreadsheet when you could actually have a workflow module that does all the tracking for you, for example. And it's about automating whatever you can automate and standardizing your processes so that they're predictable, and then monitoring the results and using the insights from those results to make further improvements. And those are, very concrete improvements that you can make to your operations. But if you're talking to the, the management level, they want to know more about how is this going to help respond to our business needs and user needs. So you can say that, doing all these things in the left-hand column mean that you can do all these things in the right-hand column. You will have that agility to scale. You'll be able to respond to demand. You're going to have enough resource availability that you can always absorb a bit more work instead of being, at maximum capacity and having everything break down. You are automating this continuous delivery pipeline and so on. So those are the things that we think about when we're thinking about operational, content ops or operational improvement. So how do you go from content strategy to content operations? Well, we have a few ways. So McKinsey talks about digital marketing. And I think that if they took that digital marketing out and just said content, they would have a very good definition here. So content operations involves the application of capabilities, so that's your skill sets, processes, how we do things, structures, all the infrastructures around, and technologies to cost effectively exploit and scale interactivity, targeting, personalization, optimization of digital channels. That says it all. So what we see happening in the overall product development is that everyone focuses on the last mile. So they're focusing on, once it's in the CMS or the app or wherever it's going to, the knowledge base, wherever it's going to be handled, how do we get it into there and then deliver it really efficiently? So that's like ordering food, and then they are paying attention to the delivery service. Oh, should we get them better scooters? Maybe if they had helmets, they would drive faster. But nobody's paying attention to the actual kitchen where the food is being prepared. And you can only optimize that last mile so much. At some point, you have to start looking upstream and saying, how do we optimize the kitchen? Right? And so we have that same thing in content where they're optimizing the delivery, but they're not optimizing where it's created and so on. So we're going to go on and we're going to look at another operating model, and this is IT ops. So when you look at IT ops, they talk about operational capabilities, taking that strategic intent and converting it into operational capabilities. So that's saying, here we have the strategy. The strategy is we want to get to this place. Then how do we get there? And so it's the answer to the how to the strategy of the what. And that really says it all for even for content operations. Is if we have a content strategy that says what we're supposed to be doing, then the operational model has to say how we do it. So when we look at infrastructure and processes, gather content that makes, they're calling this the content operations platform. They say that content operations is not the same as content strategy because it assumes that you already have a plan to execute on. And I think that's very important. Some places will say, we don't like strategy, we just want to do it. Well, how do you know what you're doing and why you're doing it? So anytime you start to make that plan, that's the strategy, it's the plan. And then you're going to execute on that plan. And I would say that when it comes to content operations, techcomm is ahead of the game when you compare it to like UX writing and Marcom and these other areas where they produce content, because there's not a lot of attention paid to this kind of process efficiencies. So if I were to give you a definition of content operations, and over the years I've kind of tightened it, and now it's down to, it's a set of principles. So it's not a formula. Everyone has a very different situation. So it's a set of principles that you use to optimize your content production. And why do you want to do that? Because you want to leverage your content as a business asset. And this sounds very close to what content strategy does, but the strategy is about planning for it, whereas this is actually carrying it out. So if you think about building a house, you've got the architect that designs the house, that's like the content strategist. Then you have a bunch of contractors come in and build the house. And so that's like the implementation phase where you buy whatever tooling, et cetera, and then you implement it. And then doing operations is then when you live in the house. So if you built this really efficient house, now you can go and live in it. So I want to look at how we move away from inefficient operating models to an efficient operating model. If we go back to accounting, and this is going to be long before your time. I've been to some conferences, and you're all relatively like young and vibrant and so on. So you won't remember this, but I remember this because we were taught this in university, how to do these things the manual way so that we would understand what's going on in the software. So there was in accounting or in bookkeeping, we call this double entry bookkeeping. So they had these things called T ledgers, and it was literally the shape of a T, where you would say, the name of this account is, and then you would say, all right, I have sold $100 worth or 100 euros worth of goods. So in here you put sales 100, then over in this T ledger, which is for cost of materials. You would say, okay, well, it cost us £70 for the cost of materials. And then there's another T ledger where you put £30 for profit. And then you would say, okay, now there's VAT, and on £100 it would be £20. So then you had to put the VAT over in the £20 column. And it was very laborious. So you have all these things that you have to do. And, I'm showing you these 6 steps. But what you would do is for 3 weeks, everyone would work on these. So you had a whole bunch of accounting clerks. And then the last week of the month, you would stop, and then you would do reconciliation. And you would manually start adding these things up. And of course, there were always mistakes. And then you had to course correct and go back and fix those mistakes. And then you would hand everything over to the head accountant. And then the head accountant would look at everything, and then they would say, this is our financial position for the month. And it was long and laborious. And I remember the accounting people in organizations, and this is way early in my career, were doing these things by hand. It was just so painful. And then along came accounting software. And we've all used it, whether it's for ourselves personally or we've had exposure to it through having to submit our expenses and then dealing with the accounting people. So in that operating model, you make a single entry into an accounting system, you check a few boxes, and then the system does all the rest. And if you want to see the position of the day, you look on your dashboard and click this. If you want to see this other position, you click on that. If you add some more things in later in the day, you can look again, and it just kind of keeps this running total. You kind of go, wow, that's so much more efficient. You don't have to have that 3 weeks on, 1 week off. You don't have multiple places that you have to put things. The system does all that for you. So we are going from T ledgers to dashboards. And I think that a lot of places, content people are still working in T ledgers. I hate to say this, but if you're using Google Docs, Microsoft Word, Notepad, and I hate to say this, but Notepad with some markup, you're probably working closer to the T ledger model than you are to the dashboard model. So in the old way, there are too many manual steps, very error prone. You had to make multiple entries and lots of efforts to reconcile, whereas in the new model, highly automated, there's a high data integrity factor. In our case, it would be a high content integrity factor, a single entry per transaction, and the system handles the rest, built-in error handling, and easier analysis. And those are all applicable in one way or another. Metaphors are never 100% aligned, but a lot of these apply to content. So here's an example of something that's very basic. It's too manual. So the operational assessment here is that there's no government. First I'll take you through the whole thing. So, you track things in Jira, and then you get a brief from someone in Google Doc, and then you write things maybe in Word, and then you have this PDF style guide that you have to consult, and then you get approvals via email, and then you have to print off the emails or save the emails somewhere, and then you store it in SharePoint, and then you copy and paste it into a CMS. So there's really no governance model that's being enforced here. It's this hodgepodge of tools, and the tools are meant for casual business use. Microsoft Word was invented before the internet, before the web. It was not meant for production content. It's just meant for letters and reports and things like that, for long form content. It's not meant for componentized content that needs to be tagged up with metadata and then, sent into a system. So there, if you're using that and there's lots of manual intervention and slow and error prone, that means you're going to build up content debt over time because you're going to get out of sync. There are going to be problems. So this is kind of too basic and too manual. Now here's another, if you like that animation, that came from a client of mine that had something that was very complicated. So it wasn't too basic, but there were a lot of manual steps. They had 48 systems that were all just kind of kludged together because they would build something, they wouldn't really keep track of it, they didn't document it, and then that person would leave, and then they didn't want to muck with it. So if it didn't do the job, then they would build another thing, and then they would take whatever came out of this input and put it into something else to do. And so things like looped back onto themselves. It was really quite disturbing. And that's not a way to run a business either. So, content is one of the oldest disciplines in the world. We see that there have been, pictures scratched into cave walls. This has been around for a long time. But when it comes to today's business arena, it has one of the least mature operational controls. The way you have like code and GitHub, and that works really very tightly, and you have a way that programmers sit together and they do pair programming and so on. Well, content is kind of a wild west, right? It's like we don't know where it comes from. It's like having a baby. It's like give me a baby, and you say, well, but go get pregnant and grow the baby for 9 months. And I'm like, oh, really? Like, I thought they were just babies. And so they treat content that same way. It's like, we need content. And you say, well, there's a whole process for content. Yeah, whatever. Just give us content. So there's really no attention paid to operating models. This isn't always true in techcomm. There have been some very sophisticated operating models in places like, SAP and Microsoft and Intel and IBM, especially in IBM. And so I don't want to say everyone's like this, but it's still not the norm. So it really comes down to how we apply the maturity model to content ops. If you're working in level 3, well, especially in level 4, maybe even level 5, then you probably have a good operating model. If you're in level 2 or 3, you probably have a ways to go. So if you were to improve content operations, and I'm going to show you the next slide, but I want you to take this with a grain of salt, because, as I said, it's not a prescription. It's not that there's one set of rules that applies to everybody. It's a set of principles. So if you're going to improve content operations, generally you're going to go from the state of play on the left-hand column to the state of play in the right-hand column. So you'll go from not being able to tell whether you have the right version to update it or get it approved. Well, you're going to know, you're going to go from that state to a state where the repository keeps track of it as you go. You've got robust workflow and version control, and you don't have to worry about it. Or that it's hard to tag content for reuse because word processing isn't meant for that, and then you go to some repository that makes it easy to reuse content from a single source, and so on. And when you get the slides for these, there's about 8 to 10 other slides that kind of go through this in more detail, and you can read these in more detail. And you might say, well, a couple of my things aren't on there. It doesn't matter. You can predict the before and the after. So here's an example. This is an example that's actually it's not exactly techcomm, because it's general information, but it's not marketing. It is informational. In the UK, it's done by a content designer as opposed to a technical writer. But when you look at the case study, you will get it. And I'm not going to go into all the details, but as I said, there are a bunch of slides in there that will show you step by step. We're just going to look at the problem statement and then the solution. So here's I'm going to set the scene. There's a client that produces content for the world, for many, many countries. There's very, very little generic information because they have facts, and facts change by country. The facts change by user type. So if you are a member of the public, you will see one set of information. If you log in, you'll see more information. If you log in as when I say an administrator, I don't mean a computer administrator, but you work for the agency itself, you might get more information, and by product type. And this is actually for people and companies who export things to other countries. So if you're exporting, ball bearings, it's going to be one product type. If you're exporting food, you'll get a whole bunch of different information because you don't need to know about ball bearings. So for business people, we know that time is money and they don't want to sit in a queue. They don't want to talk to somebody. They just want the information now and go. So for the countries, they have, potentially 180 variants because there are 180 some countries in the world. And the product codes, they've got up to over 25,000 product codes. And you've got about 10 different user types. So you're trying to think about, wow, even if we do this all in English, that's a lot of variants to put together, to say these product codes and these users in these countries. And so we wanted to be able to personalize the content for the audience because otherwise that's tons of information they would have to slog through on their own. They probably wouldn't get it right on the first shot. So what we said we had to do with this, we had to standardize the structures, standardize the content. Then we had to figure out a single source of common content, or that's my favorite word, and nobody seems to ever have heard of it. But we want to be able to do things like variables and content references. We want to automate the population of the data. And then we wanted to use proper software for it. And I'm saying fit for purpose software because we wanted content that's meant for production and not just word processing. So we wanted to be able to automate all the copy paste, all the tracking with spreadsheets, and all of the data, because there are data points that are being shown in the content, but they're being typed in instead of brought in from the data sets. So what we did was we measured, and there are 8 slides that will show you what we measured and how we measured it. But what we measured, so we said, okay, there are 58 steps. And there are no steps that are automated because we don't have a production system. And it takes 10 hours to update each one of those, the country page or pages. And so based on someone working on it 2 days a year, they go through the cycle about 12 to 18 times. They don't do all 180 countries, sorry. They do about 50, I think. And so it takes about 12 to 18 months to go through the entire thing. And so once we started assigning values to those tasks, based on how long it took to do each task, it was 30,000 pounds a year or per cycle. And then we said, okay, if we took out all the waste that we can find, and if you think about how do you find the waste, there's a lot of information on lean. If you remember lean from Toyota, it was meant for manufacturing, but somebody wrote a book on lean for services. And when you do it, there are 8 kinds of waste. So you start going through, and we went from 58 steps to 30 steps. And we had 7 steps that were handled by some sort of content tooling that we didn't have before that we decided was appropriate. And so the update time went down to 3.5 hours from 10 hours. And that meant that instead of taking 12 to 18 months, it would only take 4.5 months based on those same 2 days a week, which meant that it only cost them 10,000 pounds instead of 30,000 pounds for an update cycle, which meant that now they could either do way more countries, or they could put that extra time to good use, or if that person wanted to work part-time, then they could get a lot more done in that part-time, and then they had other things that they could take on. So when you start looking at the production metrics that way, you're really honing in on how much waste there is built into the average content process. So finding your starting point, how do you start? Well, the first thing you have to do is look at your business drivers. And I've talked about these in many presentations before. There are really these kind of 6 basic business drivers. Everything else falls within that. You know, it's increasing revenue or managing your risk. Like if you're in a regulated industry, managing risk is quite a big deal. Maybe you want to expand into new markets with more personalized content, like a new language, or different kinds of content for different audiences. Or you want to reduce your time to market because you're in a competition with other companies where the faster you get to market, those 6 weeks or those 2 months are where you're going to make the most money. So you want to get there more quickly, and so you have to shorten your production cycle. And then you want to build more brand trust with better content, or you want to operate with more efficiency because perhaps you need to scale and you don't want to have to hire 20 new people just to help you scale. You want to be able to keep that in check. So if we go from this, what I call the LIMP-ALONG system, to a robust content ecosystem, what do we have? So I drew one kind of a simple generic one, and it looks like this, is that you have to have a working environment where the authors can do their work. And so we have things like help authoring tools, or a CCMS, or other work. And I'm not going to say what the working environment needs to be, but that's where your working environment should be. And that's where you look at quality, you look at your tagging up your content, you look at workflow, and so on. Then you have a processing environment. And this processing environment is where you do kind of like a build. So people who do code, they know that they create code and then they do a build, and then they just wait for the build to finish, and then their finished code is ready. Well, we should be able to do that with our content, where we work on it and then we do a build. And a lot of those rote tasks are done during the build. And then we push it into a delivery environment. And the delivery environment could be the repository of a CMS or a web CMS. It could be a knowledge base. It could be many places, but it's becoming more common to kind of park your content somewhere, and then the downstream systems go and pick it up as they need it. And if you think about things like a chatbot, and I know you talked about chatbots this morning, is that you don't know what the person's going to ask, so you don't know what to deliver to them. So if you have that bank of content, then as they ask a question, it can come and get the right answer. So if you think about it in that way, it's somewhere your publication-ready content has to fit. So applying the method to your circumstances is you need to get your content strategy in order. So you need to know what the plan is and what you're accomplishing, because everything else depends on that. And I developed this 5 pillars method. If you can Google it, 5 pillars approach, and it will say kind of like how you ask the questions to get the information you need. And then from there, you create this implementation plan. And from there, you set up your operations. And you want to codify all those processes so that it's